Kirby's Dream Land is a 30-year-old game that can easily be beaten in under 20 minutes, was released on a device that couldn't even display color, and was designed by a then brand new developer working at a studio that no one had ever heard of. And despite all odds, it still managed to become one of the most iconic and beloved games of its generation. It is a game that prided itself on being simple and easy in an era where game developers were overwhelmingly focused on complexity and difficulty, and it was the start of one of the greatest video game franchises ever. Developed by HAL Laboratory, published by Nintendo, and directed by the man famous for developing Meteos and nothing else, Kirby's Dream Land was developed and released with the specific goal of finally creating a video game that children could actually beat. You see, in the early years of the video game industry, there was sort of this trend where developers tried to make their games as difficult as possible in order to massively expand the playtime of what would otherwise be incredibly short games. And as years passed and the industry developed, there was also a push for developers to create increasingly complex games in order to provide new and unique experiences that properly took advantage of perpetually improving hardware. In an era of the gaming industry that saw a continued and increasing focus on difficulty and complexity, often at the expense of accessibility and sometimes even fun, Sakurai and his team took a massive risk by abandoning long-standing industry standards of high difficulties, unfair level design, and artificial time lengtheners in order to create a game so good that it spoke for itself and justified its own price tag by its quality alone. And their efforts resulted in a breakout success far beyond their wildest dreams, selling millions of copies, receiving wildly positive reviews, and spawning an entirely new franchise that has since spanned multiple decades, dozens of games, and hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise. And that is insane. Just to put this into perspective, do you have any idea how many other brand new Game Boy original IPs went on to inspire entire multi-million-dollar franchises and are still getting new entries today? I'll give you a hint. It's literally just Pokemon. You know, the single biggest media franchise ever. Oh, and also Wario, I guess, if you really want to stretch the definition of certain words until they lose all meaning. Kirby's Dream Land is a game specifically designed to be easy and accessible, which sort of begs the question, how does this design goal translate into the actual gameplay? Really well, actually. Regardless of its difficulty, and perhaps even in spite of it, Kirby's Dream Land is an incredibly solid platformer with a lot of creative ideas and fun and engaging gameplay. Kirby's platforming physics feel great. Every level has unique gimmicks and design principles. There are a bunch of little detours and branching paths to explore, and the developers did a great job of creating a long list of diverse and creative obstacles for the player to overcome. And despite the game's emphasis on being easy, it wasn't exactly designed for stupid little piss babies. The developers clearly weren't interested in just handing the player an easy win. There is a minor but substantial level of difficulty present throughout the entirety of Kirby's Dream Land, which is honestly kind of refreshing after the past few years of easy games designed by teams that put so much focus on being easy that they forgot to develop an actual game. People hate on Star Allies for a reason. There's a decent chance you'll die a few times, and you might even get a game over during some of the boss fights, especially if it's your first time playing the game. And of course, if we're talking about difficulty, then I feel like I have to bring up the fact that the game's final level is a genuinely difficult boss rush with no healing items that ends with the longest and hardest fight in the entire game. And speaking of long and hard, this 15-minute game had a new game plus built into the cartridge in 1992. Once you beat the game in about 15 to 45 minutes depending on your skill level, you unlock Extra Mode, which is just a special kind of fucked up. Kirby's Dream Land Extra Mode massively increases the base game's difficulty by replacing old enemies with new, more difficult ones, massively increasing the number of obstacles in every given stage, and providing a few old friends with new movement and attack patterns. It is hard as balls, mean as hell, and exists in direct opposition to everything the Kirby franchise stands for, and it is incredible. It feels genuinely weird to say this about a Kirby game, but Kirby's Dream Land Extra Mode is one of the hardest games I have ever played, and I will never beat it. But honestly, I feel like we've spent a little bit too much time talking about difficulty in a fucking Kirby game. So let's talk about what makes the game so easy. There are, of course, the obvious answers, like slow-moving enemies, the heavily choreographed attacks, the de-emphasized platforming, and the generous amount of extra lives and healing items. But more than anything, the easy difficulty of Kirby's Dream Land comes from Kirby himself. Kirby as both a character and a franchise has always been at least partially defined by his long list of unique and iconic special abilities, and a few of them make an appearance in this game. His beloved float ability allows the player to completely avoid obstacles both on the ground and in the air. His iconic suck and swallow allow him to interrupt and redirect enemy attacks, and he also has two separate projectile attacks that allow him to easily dispatch enemies from a distance. And all of this means that if you don't want to interact with the game's enemies and obstacles, you absolutely do not have to. And that is a large part of what makes this game's design principles so interesting. Rather than creating an easy game by simply refusing to provide the player any meaningful sense of challenge or difficulty, the developers carefully crafted a list of abilities that is specifically designed to allow the player to avoid, overcome, and circumvent the obstacles set in the player's path should the player choose to avoid them. Which is just an impressively genius piece of game design. This means that there are multiple different difficulty levels built directly into the game, and rather than restricting the player to any specific difficulty, the developers provided players with the option to pick and choose their difficulty level at any point as they play, and that is a great way to design a game around accessibility and inclusivity, provide a player with agency and options, and directly connect a character's unique abilities to the game's design principles. And speaking of unique abilities, Kirby's beloved and iconic copy ability unfortunately does not make an appearance in this game, as it would not be created until later in the series. But interestingly enough, even without Kirby's most iconic ability, the gameplay of Kirby's Dream Land still feels complete. The platforming is solid, the levels are creative and interesting, the abilities interact nicely with the level design, and the boss fights do so much with so little. I mean, there is a reason why I beat this game 3 times in the first 24 hours after I bought my copy, and have been playing it on a near daily basis ever since. It's just so much fun to play. But if there's one thing I've learned from being on the internet, it's that the gameplay doesn't matter at all if the game doesn't look good. So thank goodness we're talking about a Kirby game. The crown jewel of the entire Kirby franchise is easily the series' iconic, cute, and goofy aesthetic. And even in the franchise's earliest entry, the aesthetic is here in full force. Every part of this game is just so cute and goofy and lively and animated. Every level has its own uniquely cute take on conventional level themes like grassy fields, spooky castles, and white sand beaches. Every cloud is a little extra fluffy, every castle a little extra magical, every tree is covered in fruit, and the sky is absolutely full of stars. The developers never once missed an opportunity to create and showcase a unique and unifying art style while making the game's levels look as cute as possible. And it resulted in some of the cutest levels in any game I have ever played. But more than anything else, the game's cuteness comes from its characters. Kirby in particular has a bunch of silly little animations that add a ton of character to the game. His whole body squishes when he lands after a jump, he flops on his face when he falls from a high place, he flattens and bounces when he runs into walls, and he goes absolutely apeshit at the end of every level. Well, actually, the apeshit doesn't make an appearance until later in the franchise, but you get what I mean. Little bro is a very special kind of adorable, and just watching him make the most of every frame of animation is such a treat. But it isn't just Kirby. All the enemies are just as cute with silly little animations all their own, and so many of these characters and designs are still around today because Sakurai and his team got it right on the first try. The Waddle Dees have their cute little waddles, the Cappies have their cute little bounces, the Chuckies look like this, Wispy Woods makes a bunch of little faces at you, Kracko bounces across his little boss arena, the Waddle Dees and Waddle Doos float around on little parasols, the Wizards hide in their little shells, and DDD is just so great. Just look at his stupid ass! Every aspect of this game's visuals is so clearly designed to be as cute and silly and memorable as possible, and the developers pulled it off flawlessly. I played Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy Color, which uses code built into select original Game Boy cartridges to add predetermined color palettes to otherwise colorless games and truly elevate their visuals beyond what was previously possible. And Kirby's Dream Land in particular gains a lot from the little splash of color these palettes add. The apples turn red, the dirt turns yellow, the stars turn purple for some reason, the Waddle Dees and Waddle Doos turn their iconic shade of orange, and our beautiful pink puffball finally turns pink. It actually feels really refreshing seeing all these characters in color after only ever seeing Kirby's Dream Land in the original Game Boy's iconic green display. This new color palette takes the game's already impressive visuals and makes them look so much better, especially when played on an actual Game Boy Color. It's a little messy on the Nintendo Switch, but when played on the official Game Boy Color hardware, the game just looks beautiful. And that's actually how I describe the game as a whole. From the iconic soundtrack full of catchy songs that still get referenced, remade, and remixed in modern games, to the immaculate character designs that haven't received any substantial changes or improvements in over 30 years, to the detailed backgrounds that add more context and environmental storytelling than is ever necessary in a 2D platformer, all the way to the cute little cutscenes that play during the actual levels. Everything about this game is just so beautiful, and I never get tired of looking at it. This is the rare example of a Game Boy game that doesn't need to be reworked or remade to work in the modern era. The rare example of a franchise that got everything right on the first try, and the rare example of a Game Boy game that makes the most of the hardware it's on instead of being held back by it. And in a lot of ways, this is also the rare example of a truly perfect game. And that's not something I've said about a lot of games. I don't think it's even something I've ever said on this channel, but I really do believe it. I genuinely believe that Kirby's Dream Land is a perfect game. And it's hard not to feel this way when every aspect of the game's gameplay, visuals, and level design are top to bottom joys to experience. Still doesn't make my top 10 though. Oh, and just for the record, Flappers, Mumbies, Boolers, and Mr. Pumpkins add a bit of a Halloween aesthetic to the game's second level, and that's just barely enough to justify uploading this video in October.